Peace, and welcome to another episode of the Quranic Remedies, where we spend about 15 minutes exploring a page from the Quran together and seeing how we can apply the verses to our lives. And hopefully, with God's permission, it helps us heal our brain, body, mind, and soul. So today we'll be reading from chapter 5, the table spread, from verses 6 to 9. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. I seek refuge to God from the accursed devil. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, the gracious, the merciful. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم إلى المرافق وامسحوا برؤوسكم وأرجلكم إلى الكعبين وإن كنتم جنبا فاطهروا وإن كنتم مرضى أو على سفر أو جاء أحد منكم من الغائط أو لمستم النساء فلم تجدوا ماء فتيمموا صعيدا طيبا فامسحوا بوجوهكم وأيديكم منه ما يريد الله ليجعل عليكم من حرج ولكن يريد ليطهركم وليتم نعمته عليكم لعلكم تشكرون. O you who believe, when you raise to pray, wash your faces and your hands and arms to the elbows, and wipe your heads and your feet to the ankle. If you had intercourse, then purify yourselves. If you are ill or traveling, or one of you returns from the toilet, or you had contact with women and could not find water, then use some clean sand and wipe your faces and hands with it. God does not intend to burden you, but He intends to purify and to complete His blessings upon you, that you may be thankful. واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم وميثاقه الذي واثقكم به إذ قلتم سمعنا وأطعنا واتقوا الله إن الله عليم بذات الصدور. And remember God's blessings upon you and His covenant which He had covenanted with you. When you said, we hear and obey, and remain conscious of God, for God knows what the hearts contain. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين لله شهداء بالقسط ولا يجرمنكم شناء قوم على ألا تعدلوا عدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون. O you who believe, be upright to God, witnessing with justice, and let not the hatred of a certain people prevent you from acting justly. Adhere to justice, for that is nearer to piety. And fear God. God is informed of what you do. وعد الله الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات لهم مغفرة وأجر عظيم. God has promised those who believe and work righteousness, they will have a forgiveness and a great reward. صدق الله العظيم. God the Great said the truth. The verses now shift from what we are supposed to be consuming in regards to spouses and from the food that God has made legal for us. And God has informed us of what is illegal to us. God has shifted now in regards to how we purify ourselves, especially before the prayer, before the standing of the prayer. Notice how God is here now addressing the believers. He's saying to the believers simply that if you are rising to pray, then these are the components that you have to wash, and these are the components that you have to wipe. Yes, in this day and age, there's a lot of confusion apparently because of what individuals are doing that is found outside of the Quran. And this is something that is not going to be beneficial for you because God has given you the clear guidance in the Quran. And if you follow this guidance in the Quran, it's going to prevent you from finding yourself in situations that is not efficient or upright. So notice in the verse how God is telling us to wash our heads, faces, and wash our hands and arms to the elbows, and to wipe our heads and to wipe our feet to the ankles. Now, there are individuals that wash their feet, but when it comes down to washing the feet, this is actually going against what God wants to do for us. God wants to purify. Yes, us ourselves, we stay purified because we've just washed our feet. But if you are in a situation where you are in the desert and you wash your feet, what ends up happening is your feet starts to, that sand that's under your feet turns to soil or mud. And that mud then starts to become your feet start to make everything around you filthy. And that would be against what God is intending, especially for the places of worship, where God told us to purify His house, a place of worship, and therefore that kind of ideology should follow through to the mosques of God. So why would you now wash your feet, and on the way to the mosque, after you just washed your feet, you're going to now, one, ruin your shoes and possibly pick up dirt along the way, and then you start stomping across the carpets of the mosque, as they put mosque carpets now, and then you end up creating a bad odor on the carpets, and at the same time you are dirtying the carpet. If you listen to what God has told you here in regards to you actually wiping, what ends up happening is you are now not causing damage to your own shoes, and you're not causing damage to the mosque that you're about to walk in. Because having the ability to wipe the water out of your feet is not something that's always easy, especially in this day and age, unless if you're going to carry a towel. Now, there is a word here in regards to what God is telling us, where we need to wash, like completely bathe or wash the area that has been inflicted in whatever God is bringing forth to us here. One of the things the author here, Talal, opted to use, he says that if you had intercourse. I believe the word here is if you ejaculated. It's not just intercourse. So this is covering wet dreams, and I believe that's where the limit is. And there are times where you have touched the women, but you have not ejaculated. And that's why I believe in the verse later on, God does tell us that if you have contacted with women. There is something that's interesting here that we have to keep in mind. God is not being explicit in his language. It's not just touching women, like having touching her hand is going to cause you to now go take a shower or wash in that regards. But God is not being explicit in regards to what he is expressing, which is sexual intercourse with women or sexual activity in general. So any type of sexual activity with a girl, at that point, you need to actually wash up, like properly have a shower from what I understand. So you either bathe or you wash, have a shower or bathe. And if it's difficult to wash or to have a full shower in that moment, what I suggest, from what I understand, is that you have to purify that area that was inflicted. Now, again, God does make a difference between ejaculation, which requires you to wash, and that does not necessitate that there is a presence of a woman. I do not believe that this is giving you the right that you now can masturbate and make yourself ejaculate consciously, because God states that you are supposed to preserve your private part except for your wives or whoever you have an oath with. So that's not inclusive to yourself. And I believe the word preserve here is in regards to the actual producing of whatever God has given us as a seed. Now, when we go back to the verse, God is also giving us the ability to exfoliate. So if we do not find water, we're not capable of finding water, then God is telling us to use sand or something of a similar nature where we can exfoliate our faces and exfoliate our hands. This kind of also covers what we were talking about earlier, where in regards to some people want to wash their feet instead of wipe their feet. But notice how God has given us now two levels. The first level is the things that are needs to be washed and the things that needs to be wiped. But when we came down into using the exfoliation to exfoliate with whatever we find, such as sands or rocks or things of that nature, whatever was being washed when we are using water, those started to be wiped in the exfoliation process. And whatever was wiped using water, they were not discussed when it came down to the exfoliation. So you can see here now that the feet are not mentioned. So God is telling us to wipe our faces, wipe our hands with whatever sand we find. But he did not mention the head, which is supposed to be wiped with water. Now that has been dropped to nothing. And the feet are not mentioned at all. Now, God is also telling us that in regards to the things that keep us impure, is if you go to the toilet, but the ghayr here is very specific that it's number 2. It's not just number 1 per se. But people do understand it in a sense that it can include the number 1, not just number 2. But I think the difference is that when you do go number 2, you do have to try to get yourself to shower or bathe in those moments before you stand the prayer, or to clean the area that's inflicted again. So it's very clear here, these are the things that require you to properly wash. And I believe that these are the things that technically would break your wudu or break your ablution before you standing the prayer. There are people who believe that you could just do one ablution or purify yourself with the water, and then that's supposed to extend to multiple prayers. But God in the verse makes it extremely clear. He says, "Oh, you who believed." So he's talking to the believers that if they are going to stand the prayer, when you rise to the prayer, then you have to commit to the washing. And that's the thing that signifies that you are about to start the prayer anyways, which is your washing. So anytime you do commit to going out to pray, at that point, it's very important for you to wash. And if you are ill or traveling, or one of you returns from the toilet or had contacts with women and you cannot find water, then sand will do. So God has covered all the things that is required. Yes, this is a verse that has examples in it, and then we could understand from that from other things. So it's not just us going to the toilet, but if we have actually touched things of extremities, not from only us, but from animals, or if you're a doctor and you're touching other people's extremities, then the verse still starts to apply. So as again, God is giving us a good example for us to see how it would fit on a scale for us to carry on. God is now reminding us of his blessings, and he made a covenant with us as soon as we say we hear and obey. These words are extremely important. So if you have not said it, for you to get into the covenant of God, you have to recognize that you heard what God says, which is right here in the Quran in front of us, and we have to accept that that is what we are obeying, that is what we are following. So when we disobey God, at that point, we're actually breaking the covenant with God. And if this is the case and we're breaking our covenant, then we have to be very careful, because then we're not going to flourish the way that we expect it to flourish. We're going to find issues in our lives that we might fall away from the grace of God, where we forget God. And we forget that we were on this path, and you find yourself more so bought and sold into this worldly life. And you forgot that covenant that you set up when you did read the Quran. You say you submit to God, and now you want to obey this book because you've heard what the book said. And God is telling you to stay conscious of God, because you being conscious of God, that goes down to you remembering God. And God tells us later in the Quran on how we are capable of remembering our God often. God states to stand a prayer so that you would remember me, or for my remembrance. And that's one of the ways that you could build this habit of remembering God. Now, you are you as a human being, you are a sum not only of what your thoughts are, but more so of your actions. You are who you are because of your actions. It's not because of who you think you are. We're just generally an entity that is built upon habits that we were able to pick up along the way. Negative habits should be taken away from us, and we should shed those away. And positive habits are things that we should be building. But that's truly who you are, is these habits that you practice. And one of the habits here that God is telling us to have is to be conscious of God. And God knows what's in our heart, so we can't sit here and start to play lawyer with God and pretend that we are hiding from God when we truly can't hide from God. Now, God is telling us as well that one of the things that is extremely important for us is to witness in truth, to be just in the way that we're witnessing, even if it's against ourselves. Even if there's hatred to somebody, we have to stand in the way that we need to stand, which is in just and to be honest. Every situation calls for its own judgment. We can't just blanketly cover somebody as a criminal only because due to his outlook in life or because of past activity. Sometimes he himself is in a case where he got oppressed, and we have to be able to find ourselves being able to judge for his side, despite him being someone who's a staunch enemy or a habitual criminal, where he does cause these problems in societies, and it's very clear that he's problematic. But when his right has been taken away from him, or somebody has oppressed him or transgressed against him, we have to judge those situations for what they truly are. And sometimes we have to side with that individual in that specific thing. It does not mean that you have now accepted his worldview or you're part of his team or his side. You just have to be able to actually recognize when things have gone against him in a way that God has not permitted in the book that we read. And that's why God is telling us that when we adhere to justice, that is nearer to piety. And that's why we need to fear God. So when we're making these judgments and we're slandering people, or we're making judgments against people that they shouldn't be judged against in those moments, at that point, we're actually going against from the fear of God, because we might recognize that this person is innocent here, but it's just because I hate him, it's preventing me from acting correctly with him. And God is extremely informed of what we do. Now, one of the verses here where God is giving us the promise. So this is his side of the covenant. When we say we hear and we obey, God has promised you that if you are believing and you work righteous, part of the belief, one of the things that is giving you that safety is you obeying, right? And you're working righteousness, you will be forgiven and you will have a great reward. Now you will have that forgiveness, and this is something that we should really always strive for, is God's forgiveness. Because we are sinners, we create a lot of problems for ourselves and the people around us. Yes, there are some people that make a lot more drastic issues and a lot more drastic problems. But us as human beings, we find ourselves doing something that we shouldn't be doing at times. Actually, wasting time is a sin on its own, technically, because God gave you this time for you to work and you're opting to not work. You're opting to waste it on something else. This is detrimental to whatever God has given you, and you're going to find yourself on the day of judgment answering for those times. That's why God's forgiveness is extremely important. Sometimes you as a human being, as out of your weakness, you're going to fall. And just because you fell, it does not mean now that you're a guilty individual that is worthy of hell. But if God does not forgive you for certain sins, then that is the case, that you are going to be going to hell. So it's very important for us to find ourselves in a position, because of our righteous deeds, that we are more susceptible and more worthy of God's forgiveness. And this forgiveness, it allows you to carry on despite these small sins, or sometimes your major sins that you have done. Yes, you shouldn't be sitting and doing good deeds just so that you would sin. But you have to remember that sometimes in the times that you have sinned, is your good deeds that can give you the ability to actually have the words to repent. If you were a criminal and you don't have much of a good deeds, then God's forgiveness, even though it's close to you, you just have to work a little harder for it at this moment, because you have not proved that you have learned your lesson, nor have you really turned to God in those moments. As I said, the religion is based upon building the right habits. If you do not have the habits to turning to God when things are not going your way, and turning to God when things are going your way, then you are going to have some serious psychological issues. You might perceive that you're a moral person. You might understand that you're not hurting anybody. And yes, you might be somebody who is positive to a certain degree. But if you don't have God in the picture, it's not possible for you to find the full picture of what you need to do. And you cannot find that motivation to push as far as you can truly go. Because with God in the picture, that sense of hope and that sense of security is something that is extremely important for the believer. And that's why forgiveness is such a big concept to the believer, because technically, God does not accept any sin. He does not want us to sin, and he forbids it. So if God wanted to be draconian in style, where that if you do one crime, you're done and that's it, then we're all in a big trouble. We're going to find ourselves in that trouble. That's why we really do need God's forgiveness. And we should ask God for his forgiveness at every corner and every turn, even in our prayers. And one of the cool chapters that we're going to read, hopefully closer to the end, it states that when you see people coming into the religion of God, that's when you should still ask for forgiveness. Because sometimes doubt itself is a sin. And it's very difficult to see our religion right now flourishing because of all these odds against us. This is a promise from God. And you, as a believer who's doing righteous deeds, you have to bank on that promise, because God does not break his promises. You might not be around to see it now, but you will definitely see on the day of judgment on how your work, how your plans, how you striving for God helped people get closer to God in ways that you might not perceive. And you will see that many people will be entering this religion as long as you're doing your part. But unfortunately, if we're not doing our part, despite God giving us mercy, does not necessitate that he forgave us. Because on the day of judgment, we're going to realize that we were just being strung along by our own minds, by our own actions. And God, in his clement and forbearing style, he allowed you to carry on. Only so that on the day of judgment, you can't cry and you say that you really didn't have an opportunity. If your opportunity got cut by someone else's actions, and again, God knows what's in the hearts. And God knows who you are, and God is extremely fair. And that action might lead you to go to heaven. So staying around in this earth more than what we need to stay for, something that is actually scary if you truly think about it. Because the longer that we're here on this earth, yes, we can produce good. There is a chance that you might do something and you forget what you've done as an error, and it might encompass you. But God already knew that. That's why he's the forbearing. And that's why we put our trust in him. And that's why we just got to focus on being good people, doing good deeds. With that said, I pray that you guys are enjoying these. All praise to the Lord, Lord of the worlds, and peace be upon you.